Brian Wilson, Mary Catherine Ham, today's newsmakers, and you, the Morning Majority. AM 630. WMAL.
8:07 on the Morning Majority. It's Brian Wilson and Mary Catherine Ham. Brian Neiman taking the day off. Let's go straight to the phone line because we have on the line Ambassador John Bolton. Mr. Ambassador, it's always good to have you here on the Morning Majority, but especially good now because, well, your name has been bandied about a bit by Newt Gingrich, who says, you might just make a good Secretary of State in a Gingrich administration. Were you surprised to hear that come up?
I was surprised. We hadn't talked about it beforehand. Flattered and honored, but very surprised. That's for sure.
Well, I mean, if he were to offer you that job, were he to get the job of being the president of the United States and offer you that job, would you be inclined to take something like that?
Well, as flattering as it is, I do think it's presumptuous for people in my situation to be saying yes or no to it. And I think what Newt was really doing, and I think Governor Romney did something similar when he was asked a question about the possibility of Rudy Giuliani being Attorney General in a Romney administration. He said he'd certainly take a look at it. I think it's a way for candidates to kind of elaborate on their views in a particular area, show the kind of direction they'd like to go in. Obviously, whether you name names or not is a political calculation, so we'll see if it catches on. But I think that's really what's at issue there, and I think it helps focus us on what we should be focused on, which is beating Obama next November.
Well, and you've been known for your blunt talk, and Newt Gingrich has said some rather blunt things about the Palestinian situation, saying that the Palestinians are number one, terrorist, and number two, an invented people. Your thoughts about those comments?
Well, number one, Hamas is listed as a terrorist, or a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, and there are a lot of people who think that Fatah, the other major Palestinian faction, although it has renounced terrorism, it's done it more for the rhetoric than for the substance. I think Newt was correct historically, and I don't think there's much doubt about that. He's been criticized more by conservatives for saying, well, you're not acknowledging the fact that there is an effort to make a Palestinian state now, and I think he corrected or clarified what he was saying by saying obviously Israel and the Palestinians are going to continue to negotiate. But I have to say, having gone through all that, I am not optimistic about the prospect for the so-called two-state solution. We've been on it for 20 years. People have recommended it even longer than that. The issue is not the concept of a two-state solution. The issue is whether there's anybody on the Palestinian side at this point who can make the hard compromises, the very difficult commitments that would have to be made, and carry through on them so that the Palestinian state, if it comes into being, doesn't turn into another terrorist state on Israel's border.
Now, Ambassador, you've talked in the past, you had talked about maybe jumping into the race, if it needed a voice on foreign policy. How have you felt that these guys have measured up in talking about foreign policy? There have been some missteps here and there. Herman Cain made some of them. Others have made others. What are is there anything that's being left out that you feel like needs to be talked about more?
Well, I think there needs to be substantially greater discussion because, we're electing a president for 4 years, and it's very hard to predict in many respects the crises we'll face during the next president's term. So I think it's important for us as citizens to know more about how the candidates think, how they'd react in a crisis, and so on. And I think it's very important, especially given the line that the Obama administration appears to be prepared to take, which is foreign policy is off the table because he killed Osama bin Laden and a number of other terrorist leaders. I mean, it's kind of a joke to think that's their argument, but that's the position that they've been taking, and it just sweeps a whole range of challenges and threats to the United States away from public attention, which has pretty much been what the Obama administration's wanted to do for the past 3 years anyway.
What is your thought for the future of Iraq and whether Iran just jumps in there and uses it to the best of its ability?
Well, I'm very worried about this. I think it's a mistake to have withdrawn American forces. I think the Bush administration made a mistake when it committed to this deadline in its final time in office, and I think we're now going to see the consequences of that. I think you've got the threat of Iranian influence rising, that's for sure. I think you've got the threat of Al-Qaeda returning and reigniting sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shia. Obviously, Iran is making a substantial effort to increase its sway in the region as a whole. That's why the conflict over the Assad regime in Syria is so bloody, because the Iranians have a big stake in keeping the Assad regime in power. And if you look at that arc just on a map, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, there's a lot at stake there for everybody.
I want to ask you about the drone that we lost. The Iranians apparently did get the drone. It's largely intact. It may have been pieced back together, but largely intact. But in their press release, and you got to take everything they say with a grain of salt, I understand that, but in their press release they said that they set an elaborate electronic trap for the drone. What should we read into that? Do they have some kind of jamming technology that we don't know about?
Well, there are a lot of reports that within the past couple of months, in fact, the Russians sold them a very sophisticated electronic intelligence jamming system. And so you have to wonder, I don't think the Iranians were operating it. It may have been the Russians themselves operating it that brought the drone down. Now, the Defense Department flatly denies that. They say the drone came down because of a mechanical or it's the failure of its own systems. I have to say, that's what I'd say, too, if I were in their shoes, because it's very worrying, not just for our drones, but potentially for our or Israeli missiles, airplanes, all kinds of systems, if Russia has developed that kind of capability, let alone that they may have sold it to the Iranians.
How much of a loss is it that they now have this drone?
I think it depends on whether the sensors and communications and guidance systems inside the drone erased all the electrons that had the sensitive information on it. But it's bad. They've got hardware that they shouldn't have. Obviously, they've got another chance to look at our stealth technology. It may not be a huge loss, but every time something like this happens, it's a downside for us. No question about it.
Ron Paul recently had some really interesting comments about 9/11, claiming it caused glee in the administration during the Bush administration.
You know, I just think Ron Paul is outside the scope of serious contenders for the Republican nomination, and his comments on 9/11, which have gotten sort of increasingly stranger as time goes on, I think are just evidence of that. I mean, however much many people admire his domestic views and his stress on the importance of limited government, when it comes to national security policy, he's just out of the park.
All right. Well, Ambassador Bolton, good to have you. Thank you for joining us here on the Morning Majority.